Welcome to the 10th edition of Architecture Film Festival Rotterdam. Our main theme this year is building happiness, and we're going to talk with three filmmakers about that building of happiness, how they created the happiness in their film. And we're talking with Christopher Smith of Newtown Utopia, Max Colson on the other side of the table of The Green and Pleasant Land, a wonderful short film, and Eduardo Clercos Papanicolau. Am I correct?
Yes, more or less.
More or less, okay. You made the short film The Disappearance of Robin Hood.
Correct.
So we're going to talk about that collective pursuit of happiness as expressed in these grand visions, these social utopias that people were thinking of in the past years. You've all made films on this collective pursuit on happiness that can be seen in these grand visions that were a kind of a top-down planning in building utopia. You see new towns that sprouted in England after the Second World War. Your film is about, well, it is about Brexit, but about a general idea of how, what the identity of a community means. And your film is about Robin Hood Gardens, that social awareness, expression in concrete, one could say, from the Smithsons in the 60s. I would say let's start with watching a clip out of your film, Newtown Utopia. And there you can see, you have an idea of the intentions they had directly after the Second World War in creating these new towns.
Yep.
Let's watch the clip.
The demand for the erection of large numbers of houses and the need to rebuild war-damaged towns are pressing. Large numbers of people in the towns are living in grossly congested and overcrowded conditions. And there is almost always a serious lack of open space, particularly in the poorer parts of our towns. I announced in this house the creation of some 10 new towns. I believe we may well produce a new type of citizen. A healthy, self-respecting, dignified person with a sense of beauty, culture, and civic pride. In the long run, that will be the real test.
Well, Chris, people say that these modernist cities have failed. There have been built many new towns in England and all over the world since the Second World War, and a lot of people say that you can't plan a city as a whole from a top-down decision. Yeah. And therefore they say they failed. But still, nowadays, in the passage of time, people still live in it and people can be happy. So will these cities become more livable in time?
I think they have to, really. I think ultimately these places are going to have to evolve and adapt. And I think all of the new towns built in the UK were satellite towns, satellites around a big city, London, Birmingham, Glasgow, Edinburgh, Manchester. And to be honest, property prices are rising so much in the cities in the UK, especially London, that now a lot of people are moving out. And so Basildon, the town that features in my film, for example, the population's growing. You know, there's a lot of migration to Basildon again. So the town is going to have to adapt, but in doing that, it doesn't necessarily mean it's going to retain a lot of the things that were designed and built in the 1940s and 1950s and 1960s. So.
But then there was a kind of an idealistic thinking of giving people a better place to live, better circumstance,
very much
green, and to get away from the damp and dirty city.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. It was very idealistic, and the voiceover you hear that appears throughout the film at different times are all the exact words of Lewis Silkin, who was the MP who pushed through the New Towns Act in 1946. And his speech to Parliament is something that's poetic and lyrical and ambitious and hopeful, and he evokes, he is the one that evokes Thomas More's utopia as a genuine kind of ambition to look for. Probably not really factoring in at the time the fact that Thomas More's utopia is a kind of parody, really, of what utopia would be. But so yes, it was utopian. It was ambitious, but like you say, it was top down. Silkin himself was actually from a working class background, but he was the exception rather than the rule. And actually, the majority of those decision makers, politicians, planners, architects, designers, were from middle class and upper classes, and they were designing towns mainly for working class people. Working class people who were coming out of poorer parts of the cities, slums, terrible working conditions, terrible living conditions. So,
which was in a way happened the same to Robin Hood Gardens, which was a complex in the city, not outside the city, but a huge complex, and based on the same ideas of giving better houses to the people. And Basildon hasn't been knocked down. It's still alive, new people coming in, or finding a way to adapt to that modern kind of thinking. But it completely went wrong with Robin Hood Gardens.
Well, I think it's also a question of the way that the city's changing, right? So I think maybe the point of departure being the war is similar, and the densification of cities at a time in which the important thing is to find ways for people to live together, to learn from the experience of the war. Maybe that's something that the New Towns and the Robin Hood Garden context shares. But what happened in the Robin Hood Gardens is that it is happening in the middle of a city, and the densification doesn't stop. And so I think what's happened is that the value of utopia, or the utopian thinking that was shared amongst architectural circles and with politicians in the 40s, 50s, and up to the 60s, started to expire in the 70s, 80s, and now by the time that we're in the 2000s and 2010s, the city has actually moved on to a great extent in terms of how it decides its priorities, what buildings, what values, what designs are going to come into the city.
That sounds a little bit too abstract for me, the city. I mean, who's involved here? In those years, one could say the community. I mean, we had a government taking care, at least trying to take care for a community as a whole. But now we've become, in this neoliberal era, quite cynical about that.
And I think that's maybe why Robin Hood Gardens was an interesting project, because it was actually a critique of modernism that was happening at the time. Alison and Peter Smithson were also contemporaries of Le Corbusier and the modernist movement, and they wanted to create something that was in opposition to it, or that was improving certain aspects they thought were deficient. So they created a space exactly for what you're saying, for people to fill in the gaps in the design, to have an open and adaptable design so that actually people could make it into their own, which is maybe one of the big critiques of the Le Corbusier style modernism.
But that sounds all very positive, and why could that be wiped away in due time? Why couldn't that be served today? And the ultimate thing is demolish it.
Well, like I say, it's different. The stakeholders have changed, and the power of those stakeholders have also changed. And so, although the community still remains as a stakeholder, around it has been created a pool of power and capital, and it's in the form of the City of London, and the fact that London is a very important node in the global capitalist system. That's become one of the stakeholders in this mix, and so it complicates the story of densification and how do we make a city or a housing complex or a housing initiative that also works for the people. How do you do it when you have this player in the mix?
Right. Well, Max, you focused in your film on tradition and on the general feelings of a community, what binds us together, and it's a way people think the right and the left are separated. You see segregation, especially in politics now, the poor and the rich, and the ones who know what the nation is about, and the ones who seem not to know what the nation is about. Does this sound familiar to you, as you're a Londoner and you see what's happening?
Well, I think could you rephrase the
well,
question?
we seem to turn away from the values that used to be.
Yeah.
Turn away from the social commitment we had.
Yeah. Well, I think there's I don't know, just as a kind of a Londoner, there's not really the debate around, or like the kind of the appetite for housing in London, or like what drives housing is not really about kind of creating mixed communities, like mixed income communities. It's about who can afford to like kind of meet the market rate for the land in the city, and that's the deciding. I feel like that's not really kind of explicitly spoken about in London, but it is just the accepted process by which land and real estate is allocated to people, and that means that you have people who are earning less moving further out, and they'll maybe be relying on the kind of high-speed transport networks to get into their kind of key worker jobs, like teachers, police, like kind of hospital workers, that kind of thing.
But maybe we can emphasize on that, on the mental situation of people. Maybe we show a clip out of your film, The Green and Pleasant Land.
I think quite a few of us have forgotten what England was like until fairly recently. That is very green, with many spaces which were genuine countryside.
In between the major cities and even some smaller towns, there are some truly beautiful places. You just have to sift through the estates and into the quieter parts.
Well, in all three films, you showed a very strong connection between the character of the place, the community binding of Robin Hood Garnet, which was very important for the Smithsons, the character of living outside instead of inside the dark city. How interesting is that for planners, and how much were you involved in that idea of bringing people to a certain place and that identification of a place? Was that your log line when you started this film?
The origin of the film was about looking at people who are kind of very protective about kind of house building in the British countryside, and
I guess, and it's, you know, I was kind of interested. I ended up becoming very interested in what they're trying to protect, and what it is that they're trying to kind of, you know, the kind of community that they want to keep, and also the kinds of, I guess, the myths surrounding the natural landscape that kind of perpetuate and kind of give rise to, you know, I guess like kind of points of view about the British landscape, but also about the nation itself.
But there I see a confrontation between a kind of traditional thinking, nothing can change, and suddenly in both your films you come with utopian ideas of that concrete mass of Robin Hood Garden, but still a very strong social feeling. But you have to explain to people, like in Basildon, there was a new town, everything was new, and people had to adapt to that. So does it need a certain adaptation for people? Do we have to learn them how to live there?
Yeah, I think it's an interesting question when we're talking about Robin Hood Gardens, because in a sense it's not just a building project, but it's also a landscape project. If you hear Peter and Alison Smithson talk about that project, actually it's thought about in an inverse way that you might think of a building. Actually, the mound, which is in the middle of the complex, which is two buildings facing each other, which are not in a straight line, and a mound in the middle. It's the mound that's the important thing for Peter and Alison Smithson. It's that open space that allows people to come out and enjoy this privacy, enjoy the scale of the everyday in the middle of the city. And then the buildings are somehow the pedestal for this open space. And so in a way, maybe they were inviting people to read the city in a completely new way. We can be very urban and we can have a high density as in these buildings, but we preserve, and the most important thing is the preservation of this open space where you can exchange.
Yeah, but that's an idea of architects and urban planners. But when the people come in, they see a complete new town with all these vast open space, and they have to adapt to it. Can you learn people to teach them happiness, as we have planned it?
I don't think you should teach people happiness. I think it's something that people should discover, and I think everyone's version of happiness is complete. I think the challenge with just using a single term like happiness is that it's so different for everybody else. You know, one person's idea of happiness is sitting in a room on their own reading a book, another person's is being in a nightclub surrounded by 1,000 people, you know. So it's so different for everyone. I think to try and enable people to find their happiness is maybe a kind of better ambition if you're building a place.
But that's a guarantee normally in the city, because it's filled with all this complexity and you can find it everywhere. But when it's one functional for living or...
Yeah, and you know, obviously the new towns decisions were made, like Robin Hood Gardens, decisions were made for what was considered to be the greater good. So the new towns, for example, were broken into three kind of distinct areas. The industrial areas were one side of the largest green space in Basildon, which was downwind as well, and then the residential areas were the other side of that. So there was a clear separation. So
it's the curse of modernism, one could say, the separation.
Yeah, and so what you've got is which kind of worked for a while until the factories closed down in the late 70s and early 80s, and so those areas became dead areas, you know, for a period. And so yeah, and decisions were made. Decisions were made that a theatre should be in that place, and it would require a cinema, and it would require public art, because public art is a very large part of the post-war developments in, like Robin Hood Gardens and the other estates around the cities and the new towns as well. You know, there was a strong belief in the kind of power of public art, and a lot of very progressive artists were commissioned by the government, by the development corporations, by local councils around that time. You know, and a lot of that came from the Festival of Britain. A lot of those were artists who's exhibited at the Festival of Britain in 1951, and their work continued. And so there was a belief, you know, so there was a decision that sculpture, public art and sculpture, was going to be good for people in some way. Someone made that decision. Groups of people made that decision, and you know, and I believe it is. But also, for when you bear in mind that those that were coming into the estates and the new towns were from working class backgrounds, their main sources of entertainment were pubs, music halls. So the expectation that high art, you know, a Barbara Hepworth sculpture near your house was going to be relevant for these people, there was a kind of disconnect. And what you find now is that these beautiful sculptures are still, a lot of them still survive and are around these towns, but no one knows what they are, who they're made by. So there's a huge disconnect, and they've never known. There's one set of William Mitchell sculptures in Basildon that look like chessmen, and the people I spoke to, no one knew. People thought it was people thought it was for children to play on, not a sculpture.
Yeah, but that's funny. So you do need to teach people sometimes, and teach them about history, or do you think, well, throw away these sculptures because we want to adapt to that place in another way?
I think just enable them. I think the problem is the information isn't there.
Right.
You know, so nowadays you could maybe have a website that shows an art trail showing all of these things, and there is for various places, but there was never a sign. There was never even a sign saying this is what this is, made by this artist for this reason. Right. You know, and so it's just kind of.
So, but they're still there. But here with Robin Gardens, they made a decision demolish it all because it doesn't work.
Yeah.
So, do you think that's sad, or do you think that's just the passage of time and it has to happen that way?
I mean, change certainly has to happen, but the question is, how does it change? I mean, and if that's the question, then I think it is actually very sad, because the way in which this change is happening, again, it's a matter of looking at the stakeholders and looking at who's on the other side and what's the result going to be. And in the case of Robin Hood Gardens, and not just because Robin Hood Gardens is an emblem of something that's happening across the country, or across the world, which is that what's our city going to look like, what contours is it going to have, and for whom is it going to be made? And in this case, if you look at the renderings that are outside, this kind of regeneration is what is usually coming in these places, which, you know, and if you look at the geography of the city, it actually plays a very specific role in terms of the finance of the city. Well, then it is a little bit sad, because the qualities that were invested in that place are replaced by the qualities of those places which had the human and human habitation and human life in the middle are replaced with actually financial criteria. Right. What kind of financial practices can this, if it's a housing estate, you know, these people that are going to live there, how can they contribute to the economy in a particular way, the businesses that are going to be there, and even to the point of how the space is going to be used, in what way, what kind of people do we want to spend time there. So in that case, I would say that it's sad.
Well, you're quite outspoken about that, and you speak from your heart, and therefore I want to talk with you all three about your fascination for this subject. Let's have a look at the next clip.
In Britain in the post-war period, there was a tremendous investment in social housing. As a product of the welfare state, there was a sense that the working class needed to be assisted, that everyone had a right to a decent home. And Robin Hood Gardens is very much part of that narrative.
It's not just about creating the individual house, it's about creating a neighborhood, and that neighborhood has something which is a luxury.
Do you know how to make... Here's a very stupid question. Do you know how to make pineapple?
Well, Eduardo, why did you want to make this film? I mean, it seems like an activist point of view how people are treating our cities and demolishing our cities. But is it that way, or are you just fascinated by how things change in time?
I would say much more that and much less activistic sense, because I think the title signals the main desire, which is to figure out what's happening, what are we losing, what's appearing, and what's disappearing, and what types of interactions are we not going to have in the way that the city is changing. I think that's creating a record or an archive of moods, of exchanges of people is the main interest that I had.
And it's very sad when you see the film that you realize we're losing those social values, and you can see that in Basildon as well. People adapt to it. Was that for you the main reason of losing that atmosphere in a society, that we should take care for each other?
That wasn't my main motivation for making the film, but you're right. I mean, that's definitely the case. I mean, and you know, Thatcher came out and said explicitly there's no such thing as society in the early 80s. You know, it was policy. It was government policy to break up community spirit, and it worked. You know, and neoliberalism and globalization have also contributed to that in various ways.
Was anger for you the main thing to start a film? Or was
No. The main starting point for me was there's a huge kind of appreciation for almost a fetishization of brutalist architecture, post-war design, modernist architecture, and I'm one of those people that likes that aesthetically. But I also, you know, having come from the area and knowing Basildon well, I knew that the lived-in experience of the people that lived in that town was there was such a conflict between those two things, you know. And so for me, I initially I wanted to make a film that explored that conflict from this kind of appreciation of the aesthetics of this architecture, these designs, these places, and the functionality, but also the impact on the people that live within it. So that was my starting point, and Basildon was the obvious location to do that because it's, you know, because of its design, because of the time period it came out of. It's got estates designed by Richard Rogers and Basil Spence, and because I know it, you know, because I have a personal connection to the area, so it was bringing those two things together was a starting point, and then just starting to. At that stage, when you start researching and meeting people, then the film kind of goes in different directions. And it was only when I started sitting down with people and having conversations you really find out. So I definitely didn't go into it with a thesis or an idea of what. It was an idea to explore something. Right. And actually the film kind of deals with what I initially set out to explore, but has become something else as well, I think.
Yeah, well, your film shows you can't judge the book by the cover. I mean, we all have the tendency to say, well, these new towns failed, but then suddenly you see there's a new society growing and complexities coming in, and which is not for nothing. You three are made a film about England and London specifically, because all these examples were far ahead, or in a way ahead of their times when they were built, and examples for the world. And now you see that England is moving back into a tradition, which is your film, The Green and Pleasant Land, which is full of irony, and it's a direct comment on what's happening here. Is that a pamphlet you made, Max?
What do you mean by pamphlet?
A pamphlet, a cry for a better world, that people are moving in the wrong direction.
Yeah. I don't think it's a cry for a better world. I think the film that I made is more just trying to piece together, you know, kind of existing imaginaries about Britain, and just seeing where that takes me. I mean, it's not or where that takes the film. It's not a scientific piece of research, but it's more just a kind of a visual manifestation of current debate and language about Britain, and I don't think it's a cry for a better world, but it's more just a kind of look at this kind of landscape, look at the myths that are mixed up with the realities of it, and that's not, it's sometimes bizarre, it's sometimes surreal, and it's also kind of hopefully like alluring and kind of, kind of emotional, and I kind of want to leave that kind of dilemma open for the viewer, rather than, to make their minds up as to, whether this kind of Britain or whether these kinds of memories are.
And that's wonderful about your film, but you give a very accurate description of what's happening now, whereas in your time, well, the films of the buildings in your time, there was still this belief in a better future. It's like the Cold War, where we rocketed to the moon and there was a new spaces to conquer, and suddenly time changes into this longing for tradition, to this longing for a country that never was. I must say, it only existed in poetry, or it. So what happened? What happened?
Well, I think that yes, the kind of the new towns and the estates and the modernist architecture and planning and progressive planning that came out, it was hopeful and it was ambitious. But actually, at that time, Britain was on its knees. Economically, at the end of the war, the 50s were tough. Like they were all over the world. And in the States as well. So these things were kind of. They had to happen because it's almost like there were no other options at the time. So the NHS and the welfare state, were born out of a very desperate situation, and it's that thing where when things are tough and times are hard, you have to innovate to get out of them. And it was innovation, it was experimentation. I think that it hadn't been done before. Large-scale building of new towns had never been done in the UK. Sure. Like that, from scratch, to house 80,000 people or 100,000 people. So ultimately, they made mistakes, and you'd hope that now you make learnings from your past mistakes. But
we hope so too. Yeah, we hope so too, that we move more into a kind of positive or optimistic way. In those years, in the 60s, 70s, 80s, Britain was still in the lead with new music, cinema. It all happened. And we must take care that we don't lose that feeling, that we don't become cynical if you see the financial world in London and how foreign investors destroy the city or hollow it out. Is that your concern as well, or?
Yeah, I think in the clip that we saw, for example, there was an image of a chair that was outside an apartment. And normally, maybe you wouldn't see a chair outside in the kind of semi-private, semi-public space, but there it was. Or maybe I think now of the public artworks that you were describing were in the new towns. I think the important thing is that we're still able to interact with those things, and we're still able to feel that we can sit down on those chairs, and we're still able to use the space and recreate the space. And I think the concern is when the ability to do that, or the feeling that we can do that, when that also isn't there anymore.
You think we can in due time or in short time create happiness as a society? Or do we have to sit back and wait till everything collapses?
I think some people are happy at the moment. It's. I think life is too nebulous to say, will everyone be happy? There were 52% of people in the UK that voted for Brexit.
Yeah.
A lot of those people are still happy about it. So it's. I think it's difficult. So hopefully they're happy about it in 5 years' time and 10 years' time, because if things work out for the best for Britain and the EU, then great. Not sure about that, but
Okay, we wait and see.
Yeah.
Are you as optimistic? As
I
Chris?
think of course we can create happiness, and that's been happening throughout human history. But as soon as it's created, that doesn't mean that it's there. That means that it disappears as soon as it's also there.
So we can create it, but we got to work on it then.
And we can expect that it will return, but not that we can keep it in our pockets.
Yeah, that's for sure.
There's Boris Johnson, a kind of UK, kind of a leading UK politician, recently kind of spoke of, why don't we, build a huge bridge across the Irish Sea to Ireland to connect the kind of Wales and England and Scotland together. And I think Boris Johnson has a kind of belief in architecture and like the kind of statement that architecture can make in constructing communities and connecting people. But at the same time, I personally don't, I think he can be very flippant with his use of symbolism, and I don't totally trust what his,
I
what
agree
he
with
is
you.
constructing.
Well, Adolf Hitler and Speer had an idea of connecting people with architecture too, and we know what happened then. So I don't want to compare him with, but
I think you just did.
Huh?
I think you just did. I heard it.
You heard it, eh? Yeah. Well, I didn't mean it that strong, but okay. We better learn from our history, I would say.
Yeah.
Well, thank you very much for sharing this debate with us, and thank you very much for sending your films.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for having us.